Our lives are laid out on a road of bumps, turns, struggles, and more. How do we respond? How do we endure adversity for learning and growth? I'm Aubrey Johnson, and we'll explore these questions and more on the road to rediscovery. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Road to Rediscovery. I'm your host, Aubrey Johnson. The Road to Rediscovery is about reflecting on life lessons to learn and grow from them, and of course, pay it forward and uplift others who are struggling through dark times. Now, as you know, on the Road to Rediscovery, you can listen to this show anywhere you get your podcasts, on any platform. If you happen to listen on Apple Podcasts, we invite you to leave a rate and review. Otherwise, please shoot us an email. We'd love to hear your feedback at roadtorediscoverypodcast@gmail.com. That's roadtorediscoverypodcast@gmail.com, and we'll give you a shout out in a future episode. We really appreciate your listenership. My special guest is a certified grief educator, speaker, and transformational coach and facilitator. She shares her own journey of grief, the unthinkable, losing her son back in 2020, in hopes that it helps others. She not only works with individuals in their personal lives, but she also engages businesses and community leaders to understand how grief shows up in the workplace. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's welcome Suzanne Jabour to the show. Suzanne, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I love the applause. That's my favorite.
Oh, fantastic. Well, you know, a lot of people were thrilled that you're here. Oh my. Well, Suzanne, first I want to express my sorrow. I'm sorry to hear about your son and the loss of your son. And I guess, at a time a person loses a loved one, they're not really thinking about the length of the journey they have towards healing at that time. And that's okay not to be thinking about that at that time, right?
Yep, absolutely. The beginning, very acute phases of grief, it's just about survival.
About survival. Gotcha. And so this may sound cliche. I've heard this about many different things, but I've also heard this about grief as well. And I was wondering if you can kind of unpack this for us. I've heard that grief is a process. And, is that process the same for everyone, or is it different? What's your insight on that?
It for sure is a process.
Okay.
For me, it's, I came to see very early that I would grieve Ben for the rest of my life. So if that was the case, I had to figure out, then what? Like that and what? It's for sure a process. Part of what's so tricky about it and so tricky about supporting each other is it's different for everyone. So there are some common experiences. It certainly changes over time, not because of time itself, but because of all the work you do to just survive and then to start to piece your life back together. And, there are stages. I don't think they were ever, people refer to the 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with, and they get a lot of hate, which always makes me so sad, because if you read like the very first line of the intro was that these will not happen in any kind of linear fashion. So you will feel all of those things, perhaps in some combination or other at some point in your grieving process, and it really, the most common thing about grief is it's a lot of emotions.
Yeah.
All the time. My daughter very succinctly put it as all the emotions all the time. That was her sort of way of being able to explain it to herself.
Yeah.
There's a lot of physical symptoms. There's a lot of psychological symptoms. Your brain goes off track for a while. There's a lot of things that typically happen to people that we don't talk about. So that's become part of my mission, is to just talk about it so that people understand when it happens to them that there's nothing wrong with them. Anything that's happening to you in grief, even if no one has ever told you about it, is perfectly normal. It just is. And unfortunately, because we don't talk about it, we don't learn from each other and have those kind of touch points of common experience to be able to use for our own kind of comfort and, survival.
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. And that was something I think you mentioned, that as you were writing, to help
Mhm.
process this, your grief, you've learned that, people have come to you and said, you've really helped them understand grief and learn, what they're going through. But collectively, we are kind of missing the mark on understanding how to talk about it, right? So my question is, and I think you kind of you alluded to it. Um, can you elaborate on how can we come together collectively to learn how to talk about it better, to be more transparent, if you will, because grief, first thing someone thinks of is when it comes to grief is the loss of a loved one, which
Mhm.
a lot of that's how it is.
Yeah.
I have a question further down I'll ask regarding grief outside of that area,
Mhm.
but but in this form of grief, the loss of a loved one, what are some of the ways that we can collectively come together to talk about it more so that we can manage it more for when it does happen?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that we can do. And you're absolutely right in pointing out that as a collective, we're really terrible at this. So
Mm-hmm,
let's just as a collective own that. We're terrible at it. We have to get
hmm
better. If we
hmm
can start there, it's a no shame, no blame proposition, right?
right, right.
Nobody's taught us. No, there's no class we can take. We're not having conversations about it, so we're not learning from each other. So if we
Mhm.
can just own that as a collective, we're terrible at it and start there, then what we can do is start talking about what we could do differently.
Right.
For me, my advice always is, all those cliches and platitudes. I kind of jokingly say, if your Aunt Mildred said it to your mom at your grandma's funeral, you probably don't need to say it ever again. Right. And, we
Yeah,
all kind
yeah,
of sense as we say those things, we kind of go, like it just, we instinctively know it's not great, but it's all we have. So we trot it out
yeah,
again. If
yeah.
we could like have a ceremonial burning of those and just never say them again, I would be
hmm
ecstatic.
hmm
What we need to do instead is a couple of things. We need to practice with those other kinds of grief that we're going to talk about, and we'll break some of those down later.
Yeah.
Because someone like me, who's a grieving mom, who, for reasons of my own survival, I needed to grieve out loud, I'm not a really good first assignment. Right? If you've
Mm-hmm.
never supported someone who's grieving and you got me as your first project, I'm sure that was terrifying for a lot of people, right?
Uh-huh.
So, one of the things we need to do is just own what's real for us. So, if you don't know what to say, I think that's okay to say. I don't
hmm
know what to say. I know I
hmm
can't make it better,
hmm
but I'm here for you. And do you need to go for a walk? Do you need a cup of tea?
Yeah.
Do you need me to just sit and cry with you?
Right.
You
Right.
know, I think owning how awkward we are is fine. The griever feels awkward too. Like that to me is part of the interesting thing is that as the support person, we have a whole lot of feelings about, we're scared. We don't want to do the wrong thing. We don't want to cause
Right.
harm. That's what I hear
Right.
over and over and over again when I talk to people.
hmm
And the griever kind of feels the same way too. Grief is a little bit scary when you don't know what's coming and no one's talked to you about it. And all of a sudden your life is a post apocalyptic nightmare.
Yeah.
That's scary. It's okay for us to all be scared together. And then we get to all be courageous together and
Yes.
take baby steps. And
Yes.
I really got to the point, when I was in those early days and people were struggling with what to say, where I had to stop listening to the words because the words sometimes were really hurtful, even
Yeah.
though I knew the intention was to build
Right.
connection. And
Right.
I just had to listen to that intention and to kind of listen to their heart.
Yes.
So what I realized is if we could do that as the supporter and speak from our heart instead of from what we think we're supposed to say or what we hope might be comforting.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I do that exercise with people in a workshop, they come up with the most astonishingly beautiful things. And that's
hmm
a great thing we can do proactively, right? If you think back to a situation where someone was grieving the loss of a loved one, and maybe you said something and afterwards you kind of thought, oh, I could see how that landed and I felt
Yeah.
weird about it.
Yeah.
Take yourself back to that time and think of the person that you and your relationship to them, because it's going to be different with every person. There's no one right thing to say.
Right.
If you were just going to speak from your heart, what would you say to them? And
Mm,
practice that because it's going to be
hmm
different for each of us.
Yes.
But what it will be is just pure love.
Yes.
Right. And
Yes.
then we can feel that. And that's, I think, where there's so much lost potential in grief to build connection.
Yes.
Where instead we all end up isolated, because I'm isolated as a griever because people don't know how to support me. And the people who want to support me are isolated because they feel scared about doing the wrong thing or hurting me.
Exactly. And it could start a crazy cycle, right? I mean, for someone who wants to be a supporter, but they don't know how,
Yeah.
they may distance themselves,
Yeah.
and then the person who is grieving is thinking, oh, they're avoiding me because this happened to me. And then, that doesn't help them in their state,
Yeah.
and when both of them need that help and need that connection for each other, that's that can be a crazy cycle unless someone steps up and come together, speak from the heart, as you say, to talk about how you feel and not just what should be the right words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's all a big feeling exercise. And I
Mhm.
think that's part of why, as a collective, we're so bad at it. Because
Yeah.
as a collective, we're also really bad at talking about feelings and emotions.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So if grief is overwhelming feelings and emotions for everyone involved,
Mhm.
then we're really in a mess.
Mm. Understood.
And that's another thing we can do proactively, right? Like if your
Mhm.
language around your own feelings is kind of stuck at the mad, sad, glad trifecta, as it kind of makes
Mad,
sense to
sad,
me.
glad.
Like
Yeah.
mad, sad, glad, that's the extent of my naming and languaging. Go onto Google, pull up an emotions wheel, a feelings wheel. There's tons of them. You will find, 82 words that are deeper and more nuanced than mad, sad, glad. And then you can
Right.
start to name them. You can start to recognize them in yourself.
Mhm.
And then if the grief happens to you, you have some way to recognize what's going on.
Mhm.
And if the grief is happening to someone else, you're a little bit better at holding your own emotions so that you don't just kind of spill them all over them, which is also not helpful.
Gotcha. No, that's not helpful at all.
No.
Oh, understood. Really appreciate that insight, Suzanne. So while grief from the loss of a loved one is quite apparent, that someone would be grieving from that, and the griever would know that, hey, whatever it looks like, I'm grieving from this because of how apparent the loss of a loved one is. Okay. Now, there may be some other forms of grief that doesn't involve the loss of a loved one, but it's 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 a change of something in some capacity in that person's life. That's a change. And my question is two-part. Okay. Um, first part is one, what are some examples of grief that does not involve a loved one? And number two, because it's not as apparent as a loss of a loved one, um, are there times where the griever doesn't even know that they're in the midst of grief or grieving?
Yes and yes.
Mm, okay. Okay.
Absolutely 100% yes. So
Hmm.
as you said, every change, even when it's a change for the better,
Hmm.
has loss attached to it. And every
Yes.
loss has grief attached to it. So we're swimming in grief all the time and we don't even know it.
Mm,
And I think, especially right now, coming out of a really tumultuous and ongoingly tumultuous, last few years,
yes.
I was going to say, especially North America, but it's really global. If you're watching, it's happening globally.
Yeah.
We're all carrying a lot of grief. We're all
Hmm.
carrying a lot of loss.
Hmm.
And I think in this moment, especially because there's been so much loss of life,
Hmm.
we're hesitant to even name and claim the other losses.
Mm.
But there's tons of them, right?
Yeah.
If you think back
Yeah.
to, spring of 2020, somehow everybody I know was going on a vacation.
Yes.
We lost vacations. We lost graduations. We lost, rituals of aging, right? 16th birthdays,
Yeah.
21st birthdays,
Yeah. Weddings. I
last
mean,
dance
also, yeah.
competitions, right?
Yeah.
Last football game. Like we lost a
Yeah.
ton of things.
Yeah.
And we want to rush back to normal. And I mean, there's two problems with that. First of all, normal doesn't exist anymore. And it wasn't that great for everybody anyway. So let's let it be done.
Yep.
And second of all, if we're going to push on to what's next without acknowledging the reality of what's been, we're getting an A+ in stuffing our emotions. And what happens when we stuff emotions is a couple of things. We know now, science has proven that they literally become malignant in our bodies because that's where emotions live. So we get sicker and sicker on a physical level. And on an emotional level, eventually that backpack, that box gets too full and it explodes in unhealthy ways. And I would suggest that that's part of what we're seeing right now with so much lashing out in anger and fear. It's a whole bunch of repressed and unacknowledged, unmanaged grief. The other place that I think it's really interesting to play around with grief, if you can buy into that languaging, when we're not talking about the loss of a loved one, but if we're talking about learning to support each other better, these are the places we can practice, right? So what if you, from a business perspective, what if you were launching a new product? So you've put all your blood, sweat, and tears, a huge financial investment, the team's invested, we all think this is brilliant, we launch it, and nobody comes. It fizzles.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Right? There's grief there.
Yes.
But we don't talk about that. But what if at your company you said, wow, we were really invested in this and we were sure we were on the right track, but we missed something somewhere and I am so sad about it. And I am so feeling all kinds of feelings. And I just want to acknowledge all of our hard work. We did our best. We missed somehow. So yes, we're going to harvest and compost. We're going to learn from this. We're going to find our road to rediscovery, as you so brilliantly named it. But right now we've slammed into the barrier in the median in the roadway and we're just a crash. So let's just feel that for a minute, and then we'll regroup. But when we just push through that and we don't acknowledge it, then we have all this angst and yuck that we're holding on to that we need to let it go.
Yes.
What if when someone applied for a job and didn't get it, instead of saying, it's okay, there's something better for you out there, like it wasn't meant for you anyway, you probably would have hated it, right? All the things we say because we're trying to be encouraging.
Yeah.
What if instead we made space for them to feel all the feelings and said something like, well, I know you really wanted that job. And I know you had a whole story made up about how it was going to impact your life.
Yeah.
And now that's gone. And that really sucks. Feel that for a little bit, and then we'll pivot and we'll look for something else.
Yeah.
But it's to just give people permission to have those feelings, right?
Yes.
And if we can practice those awkward conversations, because I guarantee they're going to be awkward and you're not going to like it. And we're all going to do it anyway, because we've already accepted that as a collective, we're terrible at this and we want to get better.
Yep.
That's a place for us to practice. So then when you're facing someone who's lost a loved one, you have a little bit of comfort, you have a little bit of language, you have a little bit of ability to hold on to your own emotions while you're, experiencing theirs.
Yeah.
And you're a little bit more comfortable. That, I think, is how we get better.
That makes a lot of sense. No, it truly does. And it almost seems as if you're reading my mind, Suzanne, because I wanted to kind of pivot to your work. Okay. And in understanding your work with others, from what you've expressed right here, it sounds like there's a lot of teaching your clients how to be, right? How to be and stand in their discomfort, stand in their awkwardness. And there's some value and purpose to that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The more that I study grief and the more that I work with people, the more that I see that it's this amazing doorway in to a whole bunch of the other work that we need to do together. But it's a way in that we can kind of understand a little bit. We have a little bit of a concept of it. We've all experienced it somewhat. Maybe we haven't lost loved ones yet, but we've all had losses. And when we can start to own that those had some emotions attached to them, we can start to have these conversations. We can look at things like our emotional intelligence, our emotional agility. And what I'm really aiming to build with organizations is grief resilience, because the grief is going to happen. And it's all about what we do next. And if we're pretending as an organization, as a business, that, 2 or 3 days off and a referral to, the critical response team or the employee assistance program where you get 1 or 2 sessions is all the support people need in grief, we're telling ourselves a lie. And we're buying into something that places impossible expectations on the griever and really sets us up for what I think we're seeing now, where we have, super high levels of burnout. We have tons of people on stress leave. If you're looking at your company and thinking like, I have openings I can't fill, I have tons of people on stress leave, I have people whose productivity has dropped, even though there are star performers.
Right.
My challenge to you is to look at what's the grief factor. Are you a business that's in grief crisis that doesn't even know it?
Right.
And that's okay. You don't know it because we don't talk about it. So if we go back to our, collective ownership of how terrible we are at this, it's a no shame, no blame conversation. But it's really interesting to assess, especially for businesses that have grief built into the work that they do. So if you work in healthcare in a hospital, if you work with at-risk populations, if you work in lots of the social services areas, all those kinds of areas, they have grief built into the services they're providing, right? Besides the grief people are bringing from their personal lives, there's grief happening at work. So you have those kinds of businesses that desperately need grief conversations and some grief resilience, some grief literacy.
Yeah.
Then you have organizations like, I always think about like realtors and financial planners that a lot of the time are dealing with people who are having to do what they're doing because of the loss of a loved one. I'm changing my housing situation because of the loss of a loved one. I'm readjusting my financial accounts because of the loss of a loved one. So it's not grief that happens at the workplace, but people who are coming to you for help or to do certain tasks have high levels of grief. So what if on that endless, menu on the phone of, that has always recently changed, right? If, push 1 was for this, push 2 is for that, push 7 was for, you need someone who's grief literate to help you. What if you had a specialized team that helps those people? Because the other thing that people don't understand is as grievers, we're all sharing notes.
Yeah.
I know exactly which branch of which bank I will never bank at because the bank manager was hideous to a friend of mine when he was deeply grieving.
Right?
We're all sharing, right? I tell everyone about experiences I've had at companies that were terrible and the ones that were amazing. So if it is impacting your bottom line. The most recent study I found was from the CDC, and they, I think it was 2021, because what are we in now? 23. So 2021, I think. And they priced unsupported grief in the workplace at $223.8 billion. Wow. This is a big deal that we're not talking about. Unsupported grief in the workplace.
Oh my goodness.
This is a big deal.
Yeah, that's a huge deal. I mean,
that's a huge deal.
That's money off the bottom line for businesses, and so I guess what needs to happen is twofold. I think, right? First, the awareness to the business leaders on this astounding number, collectively, and then that would hopefully encourage them to, take that microscope and say, I wonder where we fit in this, right?
Yeah.
And then number 2, the skills and the tools to manage it better so that it is supported. Are those usually the 2 things to address when it comes to working with a business?
Yeah, 100%. So I start with kind of a grief assessment, right?
Yeah.
Where is it in your business? Who's dealing with it? If we assume that people have grief from their personal lives they're bringing to work, that's one aspect that exists for every business.
Right.
And then where is it in your business that it's especially present? So is it your front-facing customer service people, for example, or is it your social workers who are dealing with people who have high-risk existences, right? Where does it show up just for your business? That's a place to start. Then we have to look at leadership, because this is one spot where if we want to make this kind of cultural shift, it has to be top down. I'm not a big proponent of top down, hardly ever, but this is one where if we're going to ask staff to have honest conversations about feelings, that has to come from the leadership. It has to be modeled by the leadership, and it has to be talked about by the leadership. So that's where we start.
Yeah.
And then we just do some really basic grief literacy. Let's talk about how grief really works. Let's talk about some of the symptoms.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the things you and I've talked about. What could we say to a colleague who comes back to work after their 3 days off
Yeah.
that doesn't make us feel awful and doesn't make them feel like we don't get it, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And again, you're reading my mind, right? I mean, I'm thinking, because I don't know, I'm thinking, and I've had this happen in my workplace, with me when my father passed back in 2006, you know. So it's
Mhm.
like I had my 3 days off,
Mhm.
and you know, I even had some coworkers, you know, come to the service and everything.
Nice.
And so, you know, you have on this side your coworkers who are at work, and they're probably, you know, in a room. They're like, man, Aubrey's lost his dad. I know he's crushed, man. We need to do something nice for him. He returns in 3 days, and in 3 days, you know, let's take him to lunch, or let's do this, or you
Mhm.
know, how do we go about, you know, just making him, welcoming him back, okay, again, without overwhelming him, right? And
Mhm.
then me on this side, I'm coming to work my first day back in 3 days, and I'm thinking, man, you know, I know as soon as I walk down the hall, you know, just one person after another, and I know they mean well, but you know, you only can take so many, you know, sorry about your loss, sorry about your
Yep.
loss, sorry about your loss. But you know, and so I'm like, I don't want to get overwhelmed with that, and I want to come back to some degree of normalcy,
Mhm.
and be heads down and focus on my work, right?
Yep.
So, is part of your workshop, or part of your workshops, with the businesses, involve learning as a team of grieve supporters, who are coworkers,
Mhm.
to walk that balance beam between showing support without overcrowding or
Yeah.
overwhelming the griever returning to work, wanting to have some sort of normalcy?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Okay.
that's something really important for people to understand.
Hmm.
For a lot of grievers, going back to work is actually really healthy and helpful because
Yeah.
they get that kind of touch point with the normal world, right?
Hmm.
Even though your
Hmm.
life is like you don't even understand how it works anymore.
Yeah.
When you're in that post apocalyptic nightmare life and you see the normal world just moving on without you,
Yeah.
you get more and more distance from it. And that's really hard. So, for a lot of people, work is like an 8-hour reprieve from grief where you get
Yes.
to go be as normal as possible. And then you go home and you curl up in a ball on the couch.
Right. Right. Right.
Right? Other grievers
Yeah.
are like me. I had to grieve out loud everywhere. Bless
Hmm.
my coworkers. They were
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
okay with it, right?
Right.
And so there is that, it's a vast spectrum of how people might
Right.
want to deal with it at work. So what
Hmm.
we do as part of the workshops, as part of the program, is we look at how do we support all of those people?
Right.
What it normally looks like is the best I can describe it is like a menu
Hmm.
of potential supports that you can access.
Hmm.
One of the things we talk about too is before that person comes back, their supervisor needs to reach out and say, we know you're coming back on Thursday. Do you want to talk to people about it or not? Or
Yeah.
shall I
Yeah.
just share with the team that
Hmm.
they're thinking about you, but you just need to come and like get your bearings and
Yeah.
you will be overwhelmed if everyone comes to give you condolences on the same day,
Right. Right.
right? That's
Yeah.
something a supervisor can ask, right? I had
Yeah.
a customer who was a teacher and she was dealing with a situation where she had a student who had lost a parent. And
Mm.
she ended up writing to the mom and saying, I know telling people is one of the hardest parts. Are you okay if I tell? And the student wanted to be very private about it. So they didn't want to tell the other students. But could I tell her other teachers and the principal and the
Yes.
counselor so
Right.
that you don't have to make all those phone calls, right?
Yes.
So there are,
Yes.
and that's a super easy thing to help with. Do you want people to approach you on day one or
Hmm.
give you a couple days to get your bearings? And then as it comes up, just say, I'm sorry, or whatever it is. That's a
Right.
conversation we can have up front so
Hmm.
that then, as a griever coming back, you weren't spending that whole drive in and the whole sleepless night before
Yes.
worrying about how you're going to self-regulate in the office when you're bombarded by condolences, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
absolutely, that's part of the conversation. And then what else could be on that menu? So we
Right.
know brain fog is real. Your brain is literally rewiring itself. And so it can't do a lot of other things at the same time. So how
No.
can we scaffold like when tasks are due, when meetings are, all kinds of things depending on your business model? Is flexible hours something you could offer? Because our association with time gets all messed up too, right? And
Right.
everything that used to take 10 minutes now takes 45. So
Yeah.
like time is a whole thing that's complicated to deal with. Can we
Yeah.
provide support there? And not everything is going to work with every business model, which is why it all ends up being completely customized. Because I could come in with a cookie cutter solution, but it's not going to work for anybody.
No.
And it also, this part needs to get driven a little bit from the bottom up. So I do a brainstorming session with the staff. What's our shoot for the moon? If we could have anything we thought we might want when we were coming back after a big loss, what would we want?
Right.
Make a big list. Let's brainstorm it. Let's imagine, like use our imagination. What could that look like?
Yeah.
And then that big list goes to leadership. And then we get to talk about, what can we actually do?
Yeah.
And then have a conversation all together that says, okay, based on your feedback and our ability to do what we need to do and still have a functioning business, this is what's going to be on our menu. Did we drop anything that was critical? What could we add? And we workshop that together. The beauty of that too is a bunch of ripple things happen. You are showing your staff that you care in a big, big way that they have probably not experienced before. You have buy-in from every level because the staff got to participate, leadership got to participate, everybody is playing. We're having the same awkward conversations together.
Right.
We've all sat through the same grief literacy, who's ever felt this, who's ever felt that, who's ever said the wrong thing and later gone, oh, I can't believe I said that. We all have.
That's right.
So if we can normalize some of that, then nobody has to feel badly about just being normal. And then we can start to shift that together. And then we look at how do you embed that into your culture? Where does it show up in your policy manual? How is it part of your onboarding? How do you use it to talk about why you should be an employer of choice? Right? How do you use it to say, I have this amazing thing that's different from what other companies are doing to attract key talent?
Right.
People are looking for this kind of support at work. And you've now created a structure where if I'm struggling for whatever reason, we can then broaden that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely tremendous, Suzanne, because just as since the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s even, there's been a shift in what is viewed as an effective leader, right?
Yes.
And so these days there's a shift in what are the expectations of an effective quality employer, right? And being sensitive and supportive of mental health and their employees' mental state. That's part of the competitiveness of employers in trying to obtain and sustain good talent, right?
Absolutely. And what's been really interesting to watch is, I'm in my mid 50s. I'm a different generation. I feel a lot of loyalty to my employer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Younger generations don't feel that.
No.
And the job market is such that they will walk and have a job tomorrow.
Sure will.
So if you are not up-leveling your leadership team to take on some of these, for us older dogs, some of these newer things or things that weren't part of our university degrees, they weren't part of our ongoing education. We're just catching up now.
Yes.
The younger generation, they're on this bandwagon. They're talking about their feelings in a way we never did. They're expecting support in a way we never did.
Yeah.
They don't want to necessarily have to show up. You're similar vintage to me, right? Where you remember those days where it was like, oh, you're coming to work, you leave your feelings at the door. Nobody wants to work there anymore.
No,
right?
They don't.
So we need, as business leaders, we need to step up, and that's what's going to keep us competitive. And the interesting thing too is if you have this scaffolding in place, so people know they can come back to work and be supported and still be successful, and that you value them, what kind of loyalty do you think you're building? That's where we're building loyalty, right? We're building it in our staff. The way we have staff trained that are customer facing, we're building loyalty in our customers. I can name for you the companies that when I had to phone complete strangers on the telephone and say the hardest words I've ever said in my entire life, took exceptional care of me, and the ones that didn't. And I will never forget it.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And to some degree, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it really happens and works that way, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's amazing how that works, and all those things that you said, that a company can start doing, and they're 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 benefiting in such a way and remaining competitive, and they are, I believe, they're finding a way. They're finding a way to sustain and retain quality talent from our younger generations who are so quick to go.
Yeah.
But if they feel they're supported, and when we have that structure in place to support their expectation of a quality employer, to support their mental state. And if they want a day, I mean, I never heard of this. I'm in my mid 50s. I never heard of this back when I first started in the workforce, right? Um, I need a stress-free day, or a day to decompress, or a
Mhm.
me day, or something like that,
Mhm.
right? Or a
Yep.
mental health day, you
Yep.
know, unheard of when I started in the workplace, but it's something that is expected and very real in a lot of companies today.
Yeah. And by having
Mhm.
those kind of days and that kind of response to encouraging people to stay mentally and psychologically healthy and safe,
Yeah.
we have better productivity when we're there. You
Yes,
know,
entirely.
I read this amazing article the other day that was talking about presenteeism. So we have this, we all understand what absenteeism
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah.
So now there's this new concept of presenteeism, which is
That's right.
exactly what you're talking about,
Mhm,
where I, as a worker, know I need a stress free day, but you
mhm.
don't give me one. So here I am, and I'm doing absolutely nothing productive.
Right, right.
So I'm
Nothing
present
productive.
and absent at the same
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Presenteeism, right?
Right,
And I
yeah,
thought, wow, we can fix that.
yeah.
No, but like we can fix that. What if
So
you
easy.
could come in and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm in the weeds. My
Mhm.
personal life is a disaster right now. I don't need to tell you in the details. That's not an expectation.
No, no.
I'm dealing with a bunch of loss and a bunch of crap, whatever it
Right.
is,
Yeah,
and I need some support. And so for today, I'm going to need to be able to go take walk breaks when I need them."
of
Great.
course. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
But we don't
And
have that culture embedded
no.
where those conversations are happening naturally. There's a
True.
huge onus on the employee to kind of still go cap in hand like we're still at a factory.
Yeah,
And if you're at a
yeah,
factory, that's a different conversation because we do need you on the,
yeah, yeah,
what is that thing called? Assembly line, right? That's a
yeah,
whole different
yeah.
thing. That's a
Nature
different
of work.
plan for your business model, right? That's a whole
Nature of
different plan.
work. Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
if you're a business where, we're project based, especially, the deadline is the deadline. How we get there, there's a lot of flexibility that can be built into that.
yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
most of us have been conditioned from K to 12 to meet the deadline. We're really
Yep.
good at that.
That's right.
How we get there, we can have a lot of flexibility.
Yeah.
And if we offer that and that's embedded, like if someone looked at your policy manual and saw that, yes, you had a return to work policy for someone that got injured, you have your grief return to work policy, that links into your mental health policy. Here's how we have these conversations. Here's who you go to. This is like, it's all documented,
Yeah.
which means everybody's signed on and it's
Mhm.
part of how you do business.
Mhm.
That's a whole different thing. I want to work for that company, not the one where I
Right.
have to feel the whole way to work nervous because I didn't sleep the night before because I'm really a hot mess
Yeah.
and I'm getting myself there. But I don't know that I should be trusted to do really important things. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm stressed about that, but I'm still going to try because there's no space for me to say, today is not a good day.
Right.
That's not
You
serving
know,
anybody. It's not
it's not
helping your bottom
serving.
line. If we're only
Nope.
looking at it from a bottom line, which
Yep.
hopefully most of us are evolving past,
Yep.
even if we're only looking at it from the bottom line, it's not good for your bottom line.
No. No. And presenteeism in and of itself, in my mind at least, it debunks the old school notion that because they're physically here, they're getting work done. I
Yeah.
need you here, butts in seats, at your computer working, and you've had something traumatic happen at home.
Yeah.
Mentally, you're a wreck. You're not mentally here or in the work, and this old school notion isn't serving the employer or the employee, nor the employees, especially not
Yeah.
the employee. And then of course there's disenchantment, right, and disengagement and so forth, and then you might lose good talent as a result. Yeah. Suzanne, you've shared some insight as we were just talking about this earlier. I mean, well, tons of insight anyway, but some insight regarding the source of grieving in the workplace. It's not just the grieving that an employee brings with them when they have something or an event happen at home, and they've had their 3 days and they're returning. Okay,
Mhm,
that's one form. But you've also expressed that there are some grievings that happen in the day-to-day workplace.
mhm,
So thank you for sharing that insight. I believe that's something that is tremendous for the listeners to understand of grieving happening in the workplace. Doesn't have to necessarily be the loss of a loved one, but this is grieving that we're not talking about. And the work that Suzanne is doing here is helping business leaders wake up and smell the coffee of unsupported grief that companies collectively on this globe are leaving lots of money on the table. And that money comes in so many forms. It comes in retaining talent. It comes in, just days allowed for these mental health days and grieving
mhm.
and so forth. So it comes in many forms. And another thing I want to just let the listeners know, okay, with Suzanne and I, this is not scripted, okay? She's just reading my mind because she mentioned earlier about brain fog. And on your website, you had a blog entry that really captured my interest. And it was about describing grief as brain fog. You talk about how it's a natural response to the emotional overwhelm that was experienced.
Mhm.
And so, based on that, I had two questions for you. And I think you touched on this a little bit here. Number one, and it may differ from people to, from person to person, but um, when does brain fog set in time wise, like after the event? Okay. And number two, um, what does one do in order to lift the fog?
So brain fog sets in pretty immediately for most of us.
Okay.
And it is partly that defensive mechanism, right? It's trying to sort of protect you from, um, because at the beginning, the cognitive dissonance is so loud,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? When for you, you're expecting your dad to phone, or you're expecting to have your weekly dinner, or you're expecting, to go to a ball game, whatever it is.
Yeah.
For me, I'm expecting to come home and my son to be here. Oh, now
Mhm.
I need my tech expert to fix my ring light, which is not going to happen. So let me go low tech. This is how the low tech among us do it. If you put your
Improvise.
flashlight on, there we go. Let there be light.
You look great. You look
Oh,
great.
thanks. So the brain fog sets in almost immediately because of that cognitive dissonance, because
Yeah.
of your brain literally trying to protect you from overwhelming trauma.
Hmm. Hmm.
The other thing, which I briefly mentioned, which there's a fascinating book about, which I just bought the other day and I'm dying to read, is your brain is actually rewiring itself. Which, if you think about it, here's the best way I can describe it. So when you think about, you're going through your day and you think, oh, I need to come home. I need to tell Ben that. He would think that was so funny. That thought goes down that path where your loved one is still there. And then it fritzes against the path that knows your loved one is gone. And you get that kind of moment. I'm sure you've experienced it. We all have, if we
Yes.
think about it.
Yes. Yeah.
That's your brain literally needing to rewire those pathways,
Oh
to
my.
link the pathways that understand that the person has died with the pathways that still want to talk to them, that still want to share something with
Yeah.
them, that still
Yeah.
expect them to be at home. So your
Yeah.
brain is very, very busy. The
Wow.
brain fog can last. I mean, it's a really scary amount of time. I'm scared to say it out loud. I still have some of it, and I'm at almost 2 3/4 years after Ben
Really?
died. The most acute, I
Oh
would say,
my.
for me was the first year.
Yeah.
But grief lasts much longer than people tell us, right? That's the other
Hmm.
thing to be really clear about.
Hmm.
Early grief is around 2 years.
Right.
And that's not like a number that I just made up from my own experience. It's, people have studied it. Grief experts kind of have come to this conclusion.
Yeah.
So it's much longer than we've been led to believe. And the brain fog shifts and changes over time.
Hmm.
One of the things I'll say is I'm happy to have had it in a time of great technological support, right?
Yes. Yes.
Every event I'm going or meeting I have or anything is in my calendar. I look at my calendar the night before and I set an alarm for every single thing the next day, because time is still a little bit wishy-washy. I don't, sometimes some people just always know exactly what time it is. I was never one of those people, but now I'm like, it's morning, it's afternoon. I've got that nailed. The rest of it, still a little bit foggy.
Right.
GPS, I use my GPS all the time in the car. I've lived in this city since I was 8 and I'm now 55. I know my way around.
Oh my gosh.
But I'm
really?
still like, what street is that? How do I get there? And I resisted it for a long time. And now I'm like I went for a massage this afternoon to my massage therapist.
Yeah.
I've been to his new office. I don't know. This is probably the 8th time. It's literally 10 minutes from my house.
Yeah.
I still plugged it into the GPS. Excellent.
Really?
There I go.
You do?
I do. It's really hard for me. Multi-step processes for me were really big, and that seems to be quite common. And that's a place you'll see it at work. So if you're wondering if someone might be experiencing grief at work, if it's an employee that you used to be able to say, do this and then that and then this other thing and then come back to me, and you find they're coming back to you after the first one saying, like, what was that other thing I was supposed to do?
Yeah.
That might be some grief brain fog.
Grief brain fog.
So where can we document those things, right? So it's easy.
Yeah.
Like we have so many shared drives now. You can put it on Google Docs, on Teams, and on Apple's version, on Google's version, on everybody's version. Million ways to document all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
That helps grievers and helps everybody else. And I would argue that if you are documenting all of that basic kind of boring stuff, so we're not having to use brain capacity to remember it, we could instead use our brain capacity for creative thinking and problem solving, which is actually what you're mostly paying us for anyways.
In the workplace.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that. I get that. I'm going to, for a quick minute, Suzanne, play devil's advocate.
Go for it. I love a good devil's advocate. Bring it on.
Okay. So you gave some great examples of things that you're still working through, to get over the brain fog. You've had some countermeasures and some workarounds that you're doing now with the GPS, and places that you've lived for over 45 years and so forth. And so, those are great examples of how you address the brain fog, but you acknowledge and you recognize that you have it. Okay. And this is my very remedial layman's thought of brain fog. I'm not a writer, okay, but I do like to write and express my feelings. I do like to journal, and I've always thought of brain fog. I mean, it can happen in different forms from different actions, but I tend to have related brain fog to writer's block. And so in the management of your grieving that, you mentioned you started to write and did a lot of writing. And with brain fog happening almost immediately after the event, because it's trying to protect you from being overwhelmed. Have you encountered any brain fog in your writing? I guess is my question.
Yes. And so
okay.
It's interesting. I find it more now when I'm trying to write more purposefully and in a more thoughtful way that's more educational, if you will.
Yes.
The early stuff that I wrote was literally a brain dump onto paper.
Okay.
Like I just had to get the spin out of my head and go, this is ridiculous and I don't even understand. And, here's how grief is operationalizing for me today.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how to stop crying and breathe. So I need to figure out how to do that. Thank goodness I'd read an amazing book about it just before. So I knew how to do that.
Nice.
Right. But it was more that kind of stuff. So the early writing really was just getting it out of my head. I just knew I couldn't have all that spinning in there in a way that wasn't keeping me from grieving, but I just needed to get it out. Yes, and I just knew I had to get it out.
Yeah.
And when I started to get the responses I got from people who were saying, oh my gosh, you're the only person I know who's talking about grief, or I've never thought about it like that, or thank you so much because now I can understand what's happening for my friend, or what happened to me when I lost someone years ago and never really understood what was happening.
Yeah.
So that for me was like the power of the written word. And I look back on some of those posts now and I'm viscerally back there It's so
Really.
fascinating how when you write that way, and you must find this with
Yeah.
journaling, right? When you flip back a few years to what you were
Yeah.
going through, it's like
Yeah.
you're instantly back there,
You are. You are.
and you're there with like your new lens at the same time. It's a really
Yeah.
interesting kind of, I don't know, experience.
Well, it is. And because it happened to us,
Mhm.
when I read something that happened 5, 10, 15 years ago in my journal, for lack of a better phrase, I'm emotionally invested.
Yeah,
Okay. And,
absolutely.
and so and basically for me, what that means is I read that from 15 years ago. If I'm reading an event that was sad, I'm going to be sad,
Mhm.
today, real time,
Yeah.
and so, part of me has a curiosity. It's like, I wonder what I was thinking then. Maybe I should read this, but then part of me is like, well, maybe not read it because you're emotionally involved. There may be something that will upset you. You had to get it out at that time, and that helped you then, and now it'll just upset you again. I
Mm.
don't know. I have this internal struggle with reading past journals,
Yeah.
and I don't know why. I guess it's because of that emotional investment, but it there is a huge help and a huge purpose behind it, I think, in managing through grief, and just even if it's just a brain dump, right?
Yeah.
We have to get our expressions and our feelings and what we're going through at that time just out on the paper, so
Mhm.
that whether it makes sense to us or not, and not try to be articulate about it, but
Yeah.
just get it out there. So uh Suzanne, this is absolutely extraordinary conversation. I'm really, really, really appreciating you sharing your insights on grieving, not just in personal lives, but in professional lives for the audience. And I'd love to ask you at this point, Suzanne, how can the listeners connect with you, learn more about the great work you're doing with workshops, coaching, and free resources, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. All of the things. So the best place to get me is at my website, which is alivedexperience.com.
Hmm.
I'm sure it will be in the show notes and you can click on it from there.
Hmm.
There's two really important things you can do there. You can sign up for my newsletter, which will get you in theory, every second Friday. I've missed a couple because I broke my ankle and my wrist. So it's been a bit of a
Oh,
month.
I'm sorry.
Oh, me too. It's just
Yeah.
ridiculous. But anyway, so I'm a bit behind on newsletters, but that's all you'll get from me every 2 Fridays. The latest blog post, a little bit of what I'm learning, what I'm finding out, and then any podcasts I've been on, I link to that have been released, and any workshops that I have coming up. So that's one thing to do there. The other thing you can do there, if any of this has resonated with you, or you're looking at your business going, "Oh my gosh, I need to figure this out," is you can book into my calendar. So book an appointment, book an hour. Let's have a conversation about how we can look at your business. And then absolutely click around. The blog entries are all there. There's some free
Hmm.
resources for your personal life, and there's actually a little ebook there for at business. So if you're interested in the business piece, you can look at that ebook. It's about, I think, 8 pages. It's a really easy read, but just a way to get you started kind of thinking about, is this here, and then some ideas and suggestions for, if you find it, how to get started dealing with it. So yeah, head to the website, and all the links to all the socials are there. So that's the easiest way to connect with me, those places.
Oh, wonderful. Fantastic. A livedexperience.com. We're going to make sure and have the link to that website, which, as Suzanne mentioned, all the socials are there as well. And check out the website. Check out different ways and tools that can be used for grieving. Check out the different ways that Suzanne has described or defined grief in her blog. It's really extraordinary. It truly is. And the title, and then once you read the title of what grief is in that particular entry, then you're compelled to read more to try to figure out, okay, why is grief this? Even good stuff. Okay, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, brain fog, we know that has a bad connotation, lost, stuff like that. But like a day at the beach, right? So okay, why is grief at the day at the beach? You'll be compelled to read more, is what I'm saying for the listeners here. Okay, so again, a livedexperience.com. We'll have that link in the episode show notes so our listeners can click the link, learn more about Suzanne while listening to this great conversation. Suzanne, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm very grateful that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to sit with us, share some insights, and just open yourself up to us with your journey and what you've learned and how you're helping others. Thanks so much, Suzanne.
Thank you so much for having me and for such a thoughtful interview. I really, really enjoyed it.
Oh, likewise, I have too. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in and listening. And hey, look, if you have a loved one or a coworker, colleague, neighbor, friend who just doesn't seem to be themselves, maybe they're going through some dark days of despair, not quite sure where to turn or who to turn to, I humbly ask that you please share this show with them, because on the road to rediscovery, we want our listeners to know two things. Number one, you're not alone. And two, there's always hope. The road to rediscovery, it's a movement, a revolution. And guess what? You are now part of it. We're all roadies on this journey of life, and it sure feels good having you on the road with me. Thanks again for listening. We'll chat again soon. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of The Road to Rediscovery. We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email at roadtorediscoverypodcast@gmail.com and leave us any questions or comments you may have.